Week 12 running back room data looking at the total touches, snap percentage, and fantasy points on every team. Workhorse touches and fantasy points for James Conner, 28 touches, 20 fantasy points. Nothing special out of Patterson or Algier for the Falcons. In Baltimore, it's important to note that he didn't have a great fantasy day, but Gus Edwards had the majority of the work. Slow day for Devin Singletary, but he did have 78% of the snaps still. Foreman and Hubbard both had plenty of work for the Panthers, 24 and 17 touches. No surprise that David Montgomery led the Bears in work, but it is a surprise that Darrynton Evans was the second man in line. 21 touches and 19.3 fantasy points for Samaje Perine, filling in for Joe Mixon. Nick Chubb, another big day, 27 touches, 20.2 fantasy points. And then Zeke and Pollard continued to both get work, 17 and 20 touches, but Zeke was the more productive running back. Latavius Murray led the way in Denver, but didn't do a ton. DeAndre Swift led the team in fantasy points, but he had half of the touches that Jamal Williams had. We thought this would happen more often. It has not, but A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones both had good fantasy days. Another poor day for Dameon Pierce and not a ton of work for the Texans. Jonathan Taylor, 23 touches, 18.8 fantasy points is solid. JaMycal Hasty stepped in for Travis Etienne, who left the game early, 17 touches, 20.5 fantasy points. Season and career high 15.6 fantasy points for Isaiah Pacheco, the rookie for the Chiefs. Typical big Austin Eckler day because of the passing work, 25 fantasy points. Interesting to see for the Rams, the rookie Kyren Williams having more of the snaps and having more fantasy points than Cam Akers. Monster of a performance by Josh Jacobs, 39 touches, 48.3 fantasy points. He won a lot of people weeks. Nothing crazy out of Miami, but Jeff Wilson continues to lead the team in touches. Mostert was out of the mix. Dalvin Cook, great volume, poor fantasy week again. Another solid Ramondre Stevenson week, 20.2 fantasy points. Can't say the same for Alvin Kamara, 5 fantasy points. 15 touches and 15.2 fantasy points for Saquon Barkley. Michael Carter left the game early. Zonovan Knight led the team in touches, but Ty Johnson in fantasy points for the Jets. Miles Sanders, 24 touches, 31 fantasy points. Great week for him. Najee Harris got banged up, so Benny Snell led the way with 13 touches, 13.8 fantasy points. Kenneth Walker, 15 touches, 16.9 fantasy points. A little shaky in San Francisco with guys getting banged up. McCaffrey, 15 touches, and nobody was above 10 fantasy points. With no Leonard Fournette, Rachaad White had a solid fantasy week. Derrick Henry, 20 touches, not a ton of fantasy points, 13.7 though. Brian Robinson had a great day, 20 touches and 20.5 fantasy points.